First of all, I appreciate, can you hear me in the back? I speak up okay? I appreciate Harry's invite and John's invite, and even though they invited me, I decided to come anyway.
Thanks, we're appreciated.
I was asked to speak about a couple of things, and really the two of them are related. One is Don't Shoot, and the other is Shot Spotter, and they kind of work together in our anti-gun violence program. A couple of years ago, the mayor put together a meeting of myself and the state's attorney and the sheriff and the U.S. attorney for our area, actually several years ago. We've been meeting for a long time, and we've been working through the gun crimes and always wondering what really is out there that works. And we tried some things worked temporarily, but we had a meeting one day, and a fellow named Tate Chambers, who was our assistant U.S. attorney, came back from a trip to Washington where he spent a lot of time with the feds. Feds brought him out to search around the country to say what actually works. We're spending a lot of federal money on crime control all over the country, lots of different ideas, but nobody really has gone out to say what's working and what doesn't work. And Mr. Chambers came back to Peoria and said they found one thing that was working all across the country, and it was called focused deterrence. We call it in Peoria, Don't Shoot. We adopted it. We all read the author's book. The author's name is John Kennedy. The book is called Don't Shoot. We read the book, and after reading through it and mulling it over, we decided it was worth a try in Peoria. It had been working in many other cities, and probably the one that we've modeled most closely is High Point, North Carolina, which is a city that's very much like Peoria. It's similar size, similar demographics, similar poverty issues, crime issues, etc. 17 years ago, High Point, North Carolina was pretty closely identifiable to Peoria in crime rate. They were averaging 15, 16 murders a year, and that's about where we are. And they adopted this focused deterrence thing, which was originally born in Boston. And they've now gotten to the point that they have 3 or 4 murders per year. And of those 3 or 4, often some of those are domestic cases, or cases that focused deterrence really isn't aimed at addressing. Focused deterrence, or Don't Shoot, is about gang and violent group gun violence. And its mission is to go after those gangs to quell that gun violence, and that's really its only purpose. I'll tell you, when I read the book, I struggled with some of the principles in it. There were things that the author said in the book that in my 30-some years of law enforcement, I thought I knew better. I read things like gang members don't really like to be gang members, that they don't like their lifestyles, they're not happy on the inside. And that didn't seem to make sense to me, because the gang members that I've had contact with, on the outside they've all acted like they act like they're cool, they act like they're tough, they act like they're happy, like they like their lifestyle, like they have control over everything. And what the author says, it's absolutely not true. They're very unhappy on the inside. They're afraid all the time. And that's another thing I struggled with, because they don't act like people who I would perceive as afraid. They typically are the ones that are making others afraid. That's what it seemed like to me from the outside again. But as I mulled these things over and I thought about some of it made so much sense. And when you think about it, I used to say when a gang member gets up in the morning and goes outside, but I had to make it more accurate. When they get up in the afternoon and go outside, when they walk out their front door, and when you think about this, they have to be afraid of everybody. They're afraid of their enemies, right? The opposing gangs, they're afraid of. They're afraid of the police, they're afraid of the feds, and they're afraid of their friends. Sometimes the most dangerous people in a gangster's life are the people that they're closest to, the gangsters that they're running with, that they think are their friends. So they live that life in fear. They're not happy on the inside. And probably the most, mind-changing thing for me that really got me to understand what the author was trying to say he said that something that rang so true, that the toughest gangster, if you could stand right here, the toughest gangster in the city, the kind of young man who we would think would shoot someone right now in this room and then walk over to McDonald's and order a cheeseburger and not think anything of it. When those guys, those toughest guys, are in serious trouble, when they're sitting in an interrogation room and they're being questioned about a murder, or they're facing federal jail time and they're being interrogated, time after time after time they break down and cry. And what happens is you find a way where you get through that hard shell that they've built up over years and years. They form this shell around the little boy that used to exist, the soul that still dwells inside. And when you reach down through that shell and you touch that little boy that still exists and that soul, they fall apart. And then they start to tell you what's happening in their lives, and you learn really through that process. They're not proud of who they are. They're not happy with the fact that their mothers and fathers and grandparents can't be proud of who they are because of the lifestyle they're living. And like drug addicts, many drug addicts, alcoholics, etc., they want to change. That if they thought they had the power to change, they would try and change their lives. So Don't Shoot has one job only. It isn't intended to solve the poverty issue. It doesn't solve racism. It doesn't solve the breakdown in our educational system. It doesn't solve any of that. It has only one very simple job, and that is to get these young men to stop pulling triggers. And that's the way we approach it with the young men. Our job is to stop the killing, stop the shooting. Author asked a great question. He was in Peoria a year ago. He spoke to a group like this, and when he took questions, he asked the audience, what would you have in Peoria today if you had the same amount of drug dealing that you had yesterday, but nobody was shooting each other? And I was sitting in the audience. I didn't know the answer. And the answer is you'd have the suburbs. Lots of drug use, drug dealing in the suburbs. They're just not killing each other over it. So we want to get to the point that we want all these men to be saved. Don't get me wrong. If I had my way, we would reach them all. They would get an education. They would learn those soft skills. They would find good work, family raising kind of income. Sure that if we just get them to stop pulling triggers, if we don't have that body laying in the street tomorrow. The other thing that we've come to acknowledge is there are many sets of victims in a shooting. You know, the classic approach for law enforcement, we had a murder over here at Landmark Apartments not long ago. Right? There's a dead man laying near an apartment building inside the courtyard. The shooters run off and they hide in an apartment. Classic law enforcement approach is there's one victim and one victim's family. And that one victim is the guy who's dead, and his family are victims of that shooting now. But we're learning that and accepting that there are multiple victims in this thing. Because we caught those two shooters, they're going to go to prison for 25, 30, 35 years. Their families are victims. And the shooters are victims too. They become victims of their circumstance, they're victims of their gang lifestyle, and often victims, they pursue that lifestyle quite often because they've lived a life that I can't understand. They've lived a life that's surrounded by poverty, typically most of our gang members are fatherless. They just don't have that upbringing that I benefited from. They grew up in a different world, grew up on a tough street, and found themselves in that predicament, and that violent life is a vicious cycle that continues to feed on itself. So we've got multiple victims. We've got two young men that are young who are going to spend much of their adult life in prison, and we've got their moms and sometimes dads, grandfathers, grandmothers, aunts, uncles, cousins, brothers, sisters, and oftentimes children who now have lost their loved one. One man dead, 2 men in prison. Lots of family affected. And it's the cancer of that. There was a study done recently that a single murder cost the community $12 million. From the medical care necessary and treatment, to the lost income for the families, to the impact upon the social service systems, to the cost of investigation, prosecution, crime lab, prison sentences. When you add all that up together, that one young man dead in that courtyard down the street cost Peoria, cost our community $12 million. And that brings us to what is it worth, and how much effort do we put into stopping it? And I'll confess to you too that the old law enforcement mindset is, you get a drug dealer, shoots a drug dealer, who cares, really? You got one drug dealer dead, you got another drug dealer going to prison, everybody wins. One less drug dealer, one more drug dealer in prison. Our whole industry is shifting now and finally coming to grips with the fact that that's not a win-win for anybody. That the young man that's dead has people that love him. The young men going to prison have people that love them. They have value. They still, I believe, have soul. I believe in the soul. And they're lost and need to be found. So what we do, here's how it works. And I'll tell you how, I'll start out with what we used to do. If 2 years ago that murder at Landmark happens, what we would do is go on the scene, investigate, find out who did the killing, we'd arrest the killers, we'd clean up the scene, we'd send all the evidence to the crime lab, we'd show up in court, we'd testify, they'd get convicted, they'd go off to prison, and our work would be done. As a matter of fact, after we made those arrests, we'd stand around in the police station and say to each other things like, boy, I hope there's not another shooting as a result of this. And I hope there's not a retaliation. And I hope we don't get another shooting tomorrow. But that was the response, and we considered that we did a great job. We caught the shooters. But today it doesn't work that way anymore. We still catch the shooters, but now what we did, which is different than what we did before, we know who the shooters run with. We arrest the shooters. We know what gang they're in. We know what guys they run with. We started rounding all of those guys up. We identified 26 gang members that run in the gang of the shooters and run with the shooters on the street. And we started going after those 26. And many of them will be indicted. Many of them will be indicted on federal charges, from drug charges to all manner of criminal charges. That's right. The next step, on Monday night, we're going to have what's called a call-in. We're going to invite gang members from around the city of Peoria, multiple gangs, not involved in this incident Landmark, but as a result of the incident Landmark. We're going to invite, there's going to be a room just like this, filled with about this many gang members in it. And when they walk in the room, there'll be posters all around the room. And on the posters will be those 26 men that I said we targeted who ran with the shooters from the Landmark shooting. And they're what we call the demonstration group. When all those gangsters come in the room and they start walking around the room, they know a lot of these guys on the wall. And on the wall it will say, Billy Smith arrested for dealing narcotics, facing 15 years federal crime, indictment for running with gangs, etc. They'll walk around the room and see all that. And then we explain to them, we've warned you, we have warned the gangs in the city, we are not playing. When we target a gang, we're going to be serious. Everybody, local, state, federal, we are all coming after that one small group. And we're going to make an example of that group. So the example will be the gang members that ran with the shooters. In the room, we explain to everybody that's sitting in the room, your job is to go back to your groups and your gangs and explain that we are not playing. If you put your guns down, that you will not be the next group on the wall. But if you continue to shoot, if you continue to pull triggers in the city, and your gang steps forward, and you become become our next mission. The next time we fill a room with gangsters like this, you guys will be on the wall, and you'll be the ones going off to federal prison. Then, after we give them the hard message, we bring someone up who talks about changing lifestyles and changing the behavior, and offering them real opportunity to get help. I've employed an individual now whose only job is to sit down with gang members who come forward and say, I want help. We sit down with them, we do a needs assessment, we find out what's broken in their life. Do they need child care? Do they need a GED? Do they need soft skills? Do they need clothing for job interviews? Do they need help with drug addiction, alcohol addiction, whatever it is we can identify they need a hand with. We identify that, and we go out and we find the people in our community that do that for a living to help them. And we offer them help. And we've had many come forward now and say, I don't like the lifestyle, I need to get out, I need help, and we help them. The goal of Don't Shoot is not to lock up more men in prison, it's to lock up fewer men. It's to have fewer dead bodies in the street, fewer young men going off to prison, and changing that vicious cycle that we're in. We've been at this about 16 months now. Our crime was down, our violent crime was down last year, our property crime was down, both were down about 15%. So far this year we're down about another 15%. We're starting to see signs that the crime is moving the direction we want. We are finding young men that are making changes in their life. We've got some early success stories of some young men who were cold hard gangsters, who are leaving the lifestyle, who have now gotten GEDs, getting jobs at different companies, moving on in their lives. And want to break that cycle so they're better fathers to their children than their father was to them, that their children don't become the next generation of kids running the street in gangs. We want to get to that point like High Point, that 5 years from now, 10 years from now, our murder rate is 3 or 4, not 15 or 16. And we'll have an opportunity for some questions and answers when I finish. The other thing I was asked to talk about is ShotSpotter. ShotSpotter is another way that we're going after the gun violence in the city. We have, if you come down to University, down the hill, all of this area from this edge of downtown all the way through the south end, we have a system called ShotSpotter in place. And there are listening antennas that are mounted all throughout the neighborhoods that hear gunfire. And the way it works is if someone discharges a gun, it picks up that loud sound, it sends a signal to California. An analyst sits at a computer in California, listens to that gunfire, and based on the sound waves and the sound pattern on their computer screen and what they hear, decide, is it a firecracker, is it construction noise, is it a car backfiring, or is it really a gun? If they believe it's a gun, they send it back to us in Peoria, and within 40 seconds of you pull the trigger, officers driving in their cars, they have an alert that appears on their laptop in their car, and on that alert says there's been gunfire, gives the address, shows an aerial photo, and the spot where the gun was discharged. All of these antennas that are mounted in a grid, they're all listening, and the system triangulates from multiple antennas, and electronically is able to measure where the sound originated, and it puts that spot on a dot on a map that the officer can go to the dot, and so within 40 seconds, we know where the shot was fired, we know how many shots were fired. If the shooter's running or driving or in a car, we know that the shooter's moving, we know what direction they're moving, how fast they're traveling. All of these things that we never used to have access to, we now know. We've learned, we've only been at it since November. We turned the system on in November. We have learned that 80% of the gunfire in the area that we have covered by ShotSpotter is never called in. So the gunfire that we knew about, because somebody heard it, called 911, officers got sent. We now know there's 5 times as much gunfire than we thought there was. There's only 20% of the time does somebody pick up the phone and call 911. So we are collecting more evidence. We've come on the scene. We've caught some shooters with the guns that we never would have caught before ShotSpotter. So it's become a really cool tool that we're just now getting used to and getting comfortable with. But it's going to help us clear some gun crimes and catch some shooters. And it works in conjunction with Don't Shoot. We use both approaches, both technologies to again attack the gun crime situation in Peoria. On Monday night we have a call-in. If anybody here would like to be invited to the call-in, if you would see me when I'm done speaking, I'll take down your name, give me a phone number or how we can reach you. You can only come by invitation. It's going to be at 6 o'clock Monday night at the downtown library. If you give me your name and your information, I'll make sure you get an invite, and you're welcome to come and sit in the audience and watch the call-in take place. You'll see speakers get up, give their presentations. You'll see the gang members seated in the front of the room, and you'll hear what they're going to hear. With both the warning, the consequence, but the positive message that we don't want you in prison and we don't want you dead. Okay. So with that, I'm going to open up to some questions. All I ask is that you keep your questions to issues that are kind of large scale. Well, if you have a question, why do police do certain things the way we do, or you heard something about how something we're working on, what I ask you not to do is ask me about something specific in your own personal world. Your son or grandson was stopped for speeding, and why did? Because I can't answer those questions for you. And we're going to get, well, sometimes we get, when I speak to a group and those questions start, we get caught up in the personal stories, and it's really not the benefit of everyone in the room. So if we could stick to things that are broader scale, that are bigger issues on your experiences in your neighborhood or anything that you're curious about, then please feel free to ask. Particularly if it's about the 2 subjects I just covered. Yes.
One of the points I want to make, Steve, and you've made this yourself in the past about ShotSpotter, is the officer gets a call for shots fired prior to having the ShotSpotter, gets a call for shots fired, and arrives on the scene, gets out, looks around, and so on, doesn't see anything, gets back in the squad, and the first thing he's thinking is he drives away. Where's the victim? Because those shots have to go somewhere.
Yeah. Well, a couple things. If we get a 911 call, somebody calls up, and typically what happens, we get somebody on the phone, and they say, I heard gunshots outside, sounded like 3 shots. And we ask, do you know where they came from? And most times, you kind of guess. Sounded like it was about a block away down Smith Street. And then we guess on where it might be. We go to the most likely spot, and we start looking. And we spend a lot of time in the dark, searching in the grass and in the snow for shell casings that are like finding needles in a haystack. We don't even know if we're in the right spot. Unless somebody sees the guns discharged, which most times they don't, we're searching for something we're usually not going to find. ShotSpotter puts us really close, puts us within about 30 feet of where the actual gun discharged, so we have a small area to search. We also, many times, we search a place, and you know how echoes work and your perception of where you hear something, where you think it came from often is not even close to where it came from, and so we end up not finding something. When I was a young officer, I'd go to a call of shots in a neighborhood, and I would look where I thought they may have come from, and I would check the ground, and I would check the bushes, I'd look for a body. Nobody saw it, nobody knows anything, I would drive away, and each time I drove away, I had that little fear in the back of my head that said, boy, I hope when the sun comes up in the morning, they don't find a body laying there somewhere. Because I'll have to answer why I didn't find it, even though I made a good faith effort to look. ShotSpotter is really a wonderful tool because I know if ShotSpotter says that the shot came from here, I know that if I make about a 30-foot circle around this spot, if there was a gunfire, it was in this circle. And if I can't find evidence, I don't find a victim. I've done a good job, and I've checked the area that's the right area. Saves us a lot of time. Saves us a lot of time searching places. We get folks. All of you have been around the block, so this won't shock you. But you know who shoots the most people in our city? It's a guy named some dude. We get victims walking in the hospital. Who shot you? I don't know, some dude. Where were you shot? And then many times they make up a place because they were somewhere involved in something they shouldn't have been. Drug deal gone bad. So they tell us, well, it happened on some street where it didn't happen. Might be a mile away from where it really happened. Or they shoot themselves. They're monkeying around with a gun, don't know what the heck they're doing. Stick a gun in their waistband, shoot themselves, show up at the hospital and say, some dude shot me. ShotSpotter, help. If we ever get some dude, he's going to go away. ShotSpotter helps us determine when we're being told something that isn't true. Now we've had cases where those guys waltz into the hospital and they're lying. We go to ShotSpotter and we say, there was no gunfire there, but there was gunfire over here, and we found out that this happened over here, and we end up clearing a shooting out of it. So it has a lot of advantages. Yeah.
In New York, they got a lot of mileage out of picking guns up, but of course, turn on them. Can we do anything like that and avoid court problems?
Avoid court problems for what?
For taking guns away from young men.
Are you talking about problems for helping recover guns?
Well, it's like they shake down the young men and take the guns away from them, okay? The court says you can't do that, that's profiling. We do anything like that and avoid, court fights?
Well, our stops have to be legal. We have to have good justification to make a stop. We can't just stop people because they're walking on a sidewalk. You can't just stop a group of young men because...
You do it with me when I'm walking.
There's probable cause there. We have to be careful. We have to be assertive. We have to be active in the neighborhoods. We got to be looking for guns and looking for criminals, but we don't want to violate people's rights either. We don't want to label people based on the neighborhood they live in, or their income levels, or their skin color, or their age, or their clothing style. For people my age, just about every 17-year-old I see looks like a gangster because his pants are hanging down low, his underwear is showing. It's a popular clothing style that doesn't mean gangster. It's just popular. So police officers have to differentiate between young men that are running in gangs, who are doing illegal things, who are acting suspiciously, versus young men who just happen to be dressing in a way that's very popular nowadays among young men. When I talk about, and I talk a lot about young men, almost all of our shooters are men, boys. Our girls don't pull a lot of triggers. Our girls fight like this. That's a new phenomenon. When you were young, when I was in high school, it was rare really to see a girl fight. And if it was a girl fight, it usually was two girls fighting, and it was over pretty quick. We've got this phenomenon now where we get mobs of girls, 5, 6 different fights going on at one time, 3, 4 people in each fight. They meet for the purpose of fighting. The common theory is that, and I believe this is true, when we were young, if you said something bad about another girl, it spread a little bit by word of mouth, and maybe it got back to the girl that you said something about, and maybe you got into an argument, or you might even have gotten into a fight about it. But word of mouth dies after a couple of passes. It passes through a few people, and then it either gets exaggerated, it gets distorted. It dies a pretty quick death. Nowadays, girls talk with text messaging and Facebook and MySpace, and that stuff lives forever. And so Now when a 16-year-old girl says something nasty about another 16-year-old girl, and she texts it, the text gets spread through the other girls in the school, and everybody knows about it. And it has a response. There's a response from their group to this group. Next thing you know, we're all meeting after school, and there's 25 girls out there all ready to fight. And I've never seen anything like it. But it is the new phenomenon that we're dealing with, and it's not fun. It's not fun to wade into a group of 25 young ladies fighting. Yes.
Is shots fired effective inside as well as outside at sound impedance? You know, is there
Good
much
question.
difference?
Good question. Shot spotter will often not pick up gunfire that's inside a building. It's meant primarily for outdoors. If the gun is loud enough, or if the windows are open or a door is open, if it hears it, it hears it. It's designed more so though for outdoor gunfire.
And I wanted to ask, you were talking earlier about the situation with Landmark, and you got the shooter's family is victimized, the shot person's family is victimized. What about the neighborhood? The neighborhood's victimized because now you get that fear that if I go out, I'm gonna get hit by a stray bullet.
Yeah, that's a good point too. I mean, you could draw circles around victims, and the neighborhood circle would be the biggest one. And that's really that's the point of all of this is trying to quell the violence so that neighbors can feel good about being outside, that people want to live in the city, that the city's healthy, thriving. All of that is an ultimate goal for us, that we become a safe city, that anyone can live anywhere in Peoria and feel safe, that all of our neighborhoods are livable, and that our property values increase, our quality of life goes up. But we gotta get the shooting stopped. That's our number one goal. We gotta get young men, and they don't shoot each other. That was another thing the author said that at first I thought was crazy, but he's right. They don't shoot each other over turf. It's not like in the 80s and early 90s where gangs were really organized. In the early 80s and 90s, gangs were very organized. They had rank structure. There was somebody who was in charge. They had ranks like military. What happened, the feds used all that against them. The feds came in and went after gangs with federal racketeering statutes and used their formal structure against them. Well, they moved away from all that. They're not structured like that anymore. They're very loose affiliations of young men. But they still operate similarly. They still operate with similar criminal behavior. But the thing the author made the point of that's true is they're not killing each other over who owns what drug turf. They kill each other over the same kinds of things that the girls are fighting over on the playground. It's somebody said something to my girl. It's I found out my girl's seeing another guy, or a guy seeing two girls, or it's somebody's disrespected me. So much of it comes back to this respect. If I've been disrespected, I need to retaliate. I'm not a man if I don't retaliate. And for some of those that are running in the tough gangs, the way you retaliate for a simple act of disrespect is to shoot something. It might not be a human being. It might be you shoot a car up. It might be you shoot a house up. But the retaliation for that disrespect has to be at a higher level. So if I shoot your car up because you said something about my girl, you or your group have to come back and do something more. And next thing you know, we've got somebody dead on the street because somebody said somebody's girlfriend is fake, or somebody said somebody's girlfriend is ugly. And we literally wind up with a dead 16-year-old because of that. So it's these little issues that catch fire, and these kids don't know how to cope with some of these things in a healthy way. That's another thing that we offer them is coping skills and learning how to to get through some of these things that used to bring violence, get through it in a nonviolent way. I will tell you though, I won't paint an overly rosy picture. Cities like High Point, North Carolina, that have been doing this for 17 years, have found that of the gang members, of the minority of gang members who actually come forward and say, I'm done with this, I need help, very few of them will succeed. That most of them get sucked back into the gang lifestyle. Even though they have the best of intentions, even though when they come forward they are absolutely serious, they're sick of the lifestyle, they want help, they get sucked back into the lifestyle. Just like a drug addict does, just like an alcoholic can. You can get rehab for a drug addiction, and you can have the best of intentions. You can get out of rehab and 2 weeks later you're right back into it. You're drawn back into it. And there are forces pushing you back into it. Same thing with a gang member. And the other thing I didn't mention, we're trying to take this into the school level too. If you've heard of Carl Cannon, he runs a program called Elite. He's drafting something that's not being done anywhere in the country. He's starting a piece of Don't Shoot that he's going to call Don't Start. And he's reaching down into the middle schools, trying to identify those young men who are at risk to be the next generation of gangsters. And the teachers all know who they are. The school administrators all know who they are. The neighborhoods know who they are. It's those young men that we all look at and say, boy, that kid's heading down the wrong path. 5 years from now, he's going to be a terror. Carl's reaching in the middle schools and trying to identify those young men and work with them before it's too late, before they get to that point where they can't escape the lifestyle anymore. And you know, and you're a young man, if you're a young man of 13, 14, you're living in a neighborhood with a lot of gang activity, it's not even that a young man has a tough choice. Do I go left? Do I go right? Gang crime lifestyle to the left, go to school, get good grades, try and get to college is to the right. It's not even whether or not they make that right decision. They reach that decision point and people are pushing and pulling them into the gang lifestyle. You've got gangsters that are trying to recruit them, trying to pull them down their path. And misery loves company. They want those youngsters to come up underneath and do their dirty work. And if they don't have if they don't have the pushing and pulling to go the other way, if they don't have that solid foundation at home, solid mom, solid father, especially for a young man, grandpa, uncle, somebody in their life that they trust, that loves them, and a positive male influence, then all they get is that pushing and pulling to go left and very little to go right. And I'm amazed. I'm not so much amazed that a young man becomes a gangster. I'm amazed sometimes that many of our young men who by all visible reasons should have gone that way become successful. Somehow, in all of their tough circumstances, they find their way down the right path instead of the left path. And I've worked with many cops that grew up in the Taft homes and the Harrison homes of the world. I grew up in the Milwaukee Police Department. I was born and raised in Milwaukee, and we had our Taft homes and our Harrison homes and you name it, we had all the same things going on there. And I worked with many cops who grew up with a single mom, grew up in a housing project, surrounded by all the stuff these kids are surrounded by, and by the grace of God somehow they found their way. And what we're trying to do is for those young men who say, I want some help, we want to find help. And we're going to save some. We're not going to save them all, we're going to save some. But if we get the shooting to slow down, we can stop some of this killing and save a few young men, keep them out of prison. It's worth everything we got. And we've got some naysayers. I go around town and I hear some of this, it's never going to work. You've tried lots of things before, it didn't work, and a year from now it's going to be something different. What we were doing didn't work. Arresting our way out of the problem didn't work. And I can tell you that 5 years ago, if you just said that to me, I'd have thought you were crazy. 5 years ago, I thought, I don't care how much prisons cost, we need to build more. You cannot let these dangerous folks run the streets. I've come around. We can't arrest ourselves out of this problem. We're not gonna incarcerate our way out of the problem. We gotta find a way to reach these young men. In the toughest gangster, absent somebody who's a psychopath that doesn't know right from wrong, in the toughest gangster, there's still an 8-year-old boy. And I use the 8-year-old boy example because what really got us down this road was the killing of an 8-year-old boy named Albert Phillips. And when I talk to those gangsters on Monday, I tell them Albert Phillips' story. Albert's father was running with gangs. Albert was shot. Gangsters drove up on Albert's house. Albert was on the second story of a house. He was sleeping on a mattress on the floor, and a rifle round came through the window casing and pierced his head while he slept and took half of his head away. And I show him a picture of it. And Albert never woke. God's grace, Albert never felt a thing. Albert was asleep, never woke up. When Albert woke up, he woke up in my mind in a better place. But Albert was not a random victim. He was a random victim in that the shooter didn't want Albert, but he was not a totally random victim. The shooter wanted Albert's dad. Albert became a victim of the lifestyle that his father was in. And we're trying to get to the Albert's fathers of the world and prevent the next Albert. And I show them those pictures, and you should see these guys turn away. When I show the picture of Albert on the bed, he looks like he's sleeping. Next picture is a different view, and they turn away. I'll tell you one last story. This is my best don't shoot story. This is totally accidental. We did our first call-in last December before last, almost a year and a half ago. And it was about a year after Albert's murder. We had about 25 gangsters in the room, and they were seated kind of like this group is here, left to right, several rows back. In that front left seat where this gentleman with the hat on was sitting was one of the gangsters, and he was slouched in the seat. He was leaning over, his head down. He wasn't paying any attention. He was too cool to listen. He never once made eye contact with us while we spoke. I got up, never looked my way. He was all leaning back, acting cool. I started talking about Albert, and he looked up, and he sat up. And then I started telling Albert's story, and when I got to the photo of Albert in the bedroom, he looked down and then wouldn't look up. But he has different posture now. He was looking, you tell he wanted to look, but he couldn't bring himself to look. The guy sitting in that chair, I realized at that moment, was the guy that we think either shot Albert or drove the getaway car for the shooter. And I started to see moisture in his eyes, and he could hear the message. And I knew that even if he shot Albert, that he still had an 8-year-old boy inside of him. And now when I talk to these guys, I talk about that 8-year-old. And I say to the gangsters, you were 8 years old one day, and none of you dreamt of being a gangster when you were 8. They all wanted to be somebody. Everybody in this room, when you were 8 years old, you wanted to be something. You wanted to be a teacher, you wanted to be a doctor, a lawyer, an astronaut, a policeman, God forbid a fireman. You might have wanted that. No. But we all wanted to be somebody. Every boy of 8 wants to grow up to be somebody that his mother's proud of. And when I tell that story, they all, even the guys slouching, sit up, and they all make eye contact because they get it. They can act tough, but they know that deep down inside, they are not proud. And so that's what we try and reach them. We try and reach down inside and grab that 8-year-old boy and shake him. Anything else? Okay.
There's one over here.
Yes, ma'am.
Yeah, I know one year you guys had a class at your place, and people would come, and then they got to go out in a police car.
Yes.
Do you still have that?
We do. We still have we do ride-alongs. We also have,
My mom was with that group.
yeah.
My mom did that.
we have a citizen outreach school. You come to a class once a week for about, I think it's about 10 weeks. To teach you how we do certain things, how we investigate a crash, how police are taught to shoot, all of the defense and arrest things. We bring in a canine, let you see how a canine works, take you out on a ride along. So if anybody's interested in that, I can take down names for that too. Everybody loves it that does it. So if you think you might be interested, let us know, and we'd love to have you. Anybody else? I think that's it.
Thank you very much.
Thanks,
You're
Steve.
welcome.